All right. So Daniel Bessner is an associate professor in international studies at the University of Washington. Today, we're going to be discussing his book, Democracy in Exile, Hans Speier and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual by Cornell University, published in Cornell University in 2018. So thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
So first question, how did you get into the field of history? Did you first come across Hans Speier? In the intro, you kind of talk about how there's no biography, or not really a lot of people have been introduced to him, and that's why you wrote the book. What first introduced you to him, and what made you interested in the history of American foreign policy?
Sure. So I had always been interested in history. I had been reading history since high school, more popular journalistic accounts and really not academic history. I majored in history in college. And then I went to grad school actually intending to do European history. But my advisor, Malachi Hacohen, had studied intellectual named Karl Popper, who was part of this transatlantic generation of scholars. Even though Popper moved from Austria to the UK, he was part of this broader transatlantic field. Moreover, I'd become interested in foreign policy in college. It was during the Iraq War. I had actually interned at the Council on Foreign Relations my last year of university. And so I had always been interested in European history and had developed a new interest in US foreign policy. And so early in grad school, I was looking for a topic to combine these interests. And an older graduate student, Sebastian Lukasik, gave me the advice that, you should look at archives. Actually, looking at archives are a good way to help you develop a topic. And so I was looking at archives at the University of Albany, State University of Albany. They have a quite a large collection. I think it's called the German and Jewish Intellectual Emigre Collection. And I was looking through them, and then I came across this guy, Hans Speier, and he seemed to combine all of my interests in that he was a socialist in Germany, but then became one of the founders of the Rand Corporation, an important national security think tank. So I thought that it would be a good way to combine my interests by studying his life and career.
Yeah, so what made you choose to do a biography rather than like a history of the Rand Corporation? I thought it was an interesting contrast that you chose to study an individual when Speer kind of came to the conclusion that individual actors, there's like a requirement of institutional power and background backing in order to get things done. So why study the individual rather than the institution?
So my advisor had written a biography, so that had always been available as a methodology to me, the intellectual biography. Studying the Rand Corporation, particularly as a dissertation, would have been very difficult. You would have had to focus on a very specific period, and there had also been a few books about Rand that had focused on its very early period. Um, so that didn't seem very feasible. What I liked about Speier was that he had basically moved through a series of important institutions throughout his life, whether it's the University of Heidelberg in Weimar, the New School for Social Research in the 1930s New York, the Office of War Information in 1940s Washington, D.C., or Rand in L.A., Los Angeles. I like that exploring his career would allow me to look at all of these different institutions through the lens of biography and through how he shaped them. And so I thought it was a good way to get at these larger issues while also focusing on a manageable dissertation project.
Uh, so what was the hardest part of this research? And the other question is like, where did you learn your German? Because you used the Dr. Fette, which is like a very German kind of idea, and I've only ever heard it amongst like other German academics. I don't know a lot of people in the U.S. who know that term. So where did you like kind of learn your German?
So I did the Middlebury Language School after I graduated college,
Mm.
which is an intensive German language program. And then I just kept up with it. You working in the archival materials, and Dr. Vater, maybe it's less now, but when I was in graduate school, people basically knew what that meant. There was that German influence on U.S. academia, going back. Someone like Daniel Rogers has traced that back a long ways. So yeah, that's basically how I learned my German.
And then what was the hardest part of this research?
The hardest part, none of it was especially difficult, to be honest. I mean, it was annoying to have to be in Albany, which is, not the most exciting place, especially when you're a visitor. But I wasn't there for that long. The advent of the digital camera age really allowed me to get a lot of research done in not that long a time. And Yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anything more, anything that I didn't really enjoy. And toward the later stages, when I was on a postdoc, then I would just ask people to basically take photos or photocopies and send me archival materials. I didn't do it that much. That was for a couple of later chapters as I was finishing it up. But yeah, the digital camera was pretty easy stuff.
So what because this is based off of your dissertation, this book. The dissertation is called The Night Watchman, which is a way cooler title, in my opinion. Uh, so, besides the title, which obviously is the publisher's choice, what were the major changes that you ended up making between the dissertation and the book?
Well, the title is actually mine. I thought the dissertation was title was good, but it didn't really, it wasn't really keywords, and it wasn't really about what the book was ultimately about. Kind of was, but I thought there was more there. And my understanding is in most academic publishing, the author actually chooses the title. But beyond that, the book is totally rewritten. I basically rewrote the entire thing because I felt like I had a better sense of what I was doing. And I wanted to build it out in a different way. So it's basically all new from what I recall. There certainly are overlaps in argument and things along those lines, but most of it is new.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the big arguments is that Speier had a shift in his kind of positions of what intellectuals do. Whereas his first position is intellectuals, he was a socialist initially or a social democrat. Um, and he believed that their job was to kind of educate the working class. And then he kind of shifts and you talk about this kind of crisis moment that then becomes an era of crisis. So where he now thinks that intellectuals have to kind of take the lead because working class, I guess, cannot be trusted necessarily. What do you think uh, is the purpose of intellectuals? Because I've also heard you on podcasts kind of talking about the historian profession is a dying breed, essentially. Uh, so, what do you think is the position of the intellectual in American life or in any society's life? Do you think that there's a kind of something in between those two positions he held, or do you preference one or over the other?
Well, I think there are a lot of different things that an intellectual can do. Probably the standard one is to be a critic. Well, but we're talking about public intellectuals, I think, because there's always intellectuals who just stay within the confines of the university, and that's fine. But in terms of publicness, I would say that you could be a critic, or you could be someone who works within extant institutions or movements to try to enact some form of positive change in the world. So there's a negative function, that of criticism, and there's a positive function, that of change. And in my own career, I've tried to kind of do both.
Okay. Would you say that his two positions were both trying to, in his own mind, trying to create a positive change in the world then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Um, and then on top of that, do you think that we're still in this era of crisis and that can we ever possibly leave eh, as long as nuclear proliferation is still present?
Well, I mean, crisis is a construct, I would say, of modern liberalism. So there's the sense of, I mean, is there an objective crisis or a subjective crisis? I think those are related questions, and they fold over into each other, but they are also kind of separate. So, I mean, there are objective crises of capitalism, of security and things along those lines. But I think what has defined modern American liberalism is the construction, as I write in the book, of a never-ending crisis. And so I think we're certainly in that stage. I think one can narrate the history of the second half of the 20th century as a series of crises, diagnosed crises, in foreign policy and other realms. But I also do think there is some sort of objective crisis, whether you're talking about the transformations in climate, the global inequality and things along those lines. So I think there is oftentimes a disconnect between the diagnosed crisis, let's say during 9/11, Islamic terrorism, quote unquote, or now the rise of China. That's a subjectively identified crisis that is not necessarily overlapping with a more objective crises of capitalism or of climate.
Okay. Uh, so, I mean, you kind of just answered my next question, but it was going to be, would you argue that the Soviet Union was not an existential threat to the US and that the concept was purely manufactured by Speier?
Well, it wasn't just by Speier, it was by very many people. But yes, I think in retrospect, pretty early on by the late 1940s, I don't think the Soviet Union was an existential threat. I actually I don't really think it was ever an existential threat, even though I could see at the time why people might have thought that. But I think by the mid 1950s, it was kind of an inertial intellectual and structural for inertial intellectual and structural reasons. The Soviet Union was read as an existential threat, which I don't think it was.
Well, do you think it was mainly, I mean, you say it never was, but do you think the distinction between what you're making between earlier periods and after the 40s was because primarily Stalin? It was more just because there was a,
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it wasn't incredibly unreasonable for people to read Stalin as someone who might have designs in a way that was somewhat analogous to Hitler. But by the time he died in March 53, it was pretty clear that the Soviet Union, I think, wasn't any real threat to the United States. Or it depends, of course, how you define American interests. I don't think the Soviet Union was a threat to vital American interests. And then after Stalin died, I do think there was an opportunity to reach some sort of peace agreement that largely wasn't reached because of American intransigence.
uh, so I also noticed, at least in your bibliography of publications, that you've written also on Murray Rothbard, who's well known on
Yes.
libertarianism. Do you find any similarities between Speier and Rothbard? I think it's interesting that you've kind of zeroed in on two, I guess, kind of intellectual movers of two different sides of the conservative uh, group or whatever in the U.S. What do you think are their
Well,
similarities?
I would actually define Speier as liberal, and Rothbard as libertarian. I mean, they're. I'm not sure there's necessarily that much overlap. I mean, they're both white men who are operating in elite intellectual circles. And well, I guess the big overlap, sort of the connection might be that Rothbard also helped found a think tank. And so earlier in my career, I was quite interested in the think tank as an institutional space.
Mhm.
So, they both come from relatively
Yeah.
similar identity categories, and they both worked in think tanks. So that's probably the biggest overlap between them. But otherwise, it's very different life histories, very different ideologies.
Okay. So that was most of kind of my history questions. So just a couple political questions. I think you've probably answered these other places, but I'm still interested in your take. Uh, what I know you've answered this because I think you've written an article on it. What comparisons would you make, if any, between the Weimar Republic and the present political situation in the United States?
Well, but in both instances, there's a lots of feeling of crisis and the diagnosis of crisis. I think that is relatively similar between both um spaces. Trying to think other similarities. Um,
Because I
Pretty
think
different
the
moments.
comparison has been made several times with the worry of like the possibility of a authoritarian rise.
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
really think that's possible. I think that's related more to liberal identifications of crisis. I think the way that society and state operate now don't allow for the type of authoritarian mass movement that oc- basically occurred in Weimar. So I disagree with that. I'm trying to think of, I mean, like we don't have a parliamentary system. We don't really have hyperinflation. We don't have a generation of traumatized veterans. There's no real socialist party here. I'm trying to think. I guess there are universities with intellectuals who like diagnosing things. That's a similarity.
Okay, so you're much more of an optimist, would you say?
No, I mean, just because I don't think that there's going to be a Nazi-like movement doesn't mean I'm optimistic. I mean, I basically think capitalism is now an agentive force that exists outside of human hands, and we're not going to do anything about the major problems that face us. I think COVID was a dry run for that. That with climate and inequality, it's unlikely that we're going to do anything to actually solve these things.
Okay. Um, okay, this is actually another kind of more history question because I thought it was interesting, even though I feel like you focus more on American history, but you are also an honors professor in Western civilization. Um, in quite a few, I'm from California, quite a few universities in California are changing uh, Western Civ classes to now like World Civ classes. The university I'm at right now, they decided to do a name change from Western Civ to the West and the World, uh, whatever that means. Do you think that that's actually like a substantial movement, or do you think it's kind of just academic performance, like performative academia, where they're trying to just change the name, but everything else is the same?
I don't quite understand the question.
Because there's a big movement in talking about changing Western Civ survey courses um, because it's too Eurocentric. There's quite a few critiques about that. I don't know if you've also experienced this or not, but in every university I've been at now, they've changed the name. For a different university, they changed it to World Civ. And at the university I'm at right now, they call it now the West and the World. Uh,
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you haven't heard of this, that's fine. But
No, no, of
I,
course I've heard of it, but what's the
yeah.
question?
So the question is, do you think it's like actually a substantial change, like,
I think that's
or do
hard
you
to
think,
answer in
yeah,
general. I mean, I think you would absolutely want to include diverse voices from outside of the traditional canon. But to understand whether or not this is a substantive change, I think you'd have to take it on a case by case basis, or whether it's just like a new name for the same thing. But I think you absolutely want to include anti-colonial thinkers, decolonial thinkers, thinkers from the global South, thinkers who were not part of the traditional North Atlantic canon that developed over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries.
okay. And then I think you said 25 minutes. So I think we're running up against the time, but
I've got like 5 more minutes but it's up to you, you know.
okay. So what is one book in your field of history? Because I know you talk a lot about politics, but actually in your field of study of American foreign policy history, one book besides your own that you would recommend people to read.
Besides my own,
Yeah.
what book would I recommend people to read? I'm reading City of Quartz right now, so let's say City of Quartz. That's a good
Okay.
book.
Okay. And then I think you're one of the few people I've really heard. I think particularly with Glenn Lowry, you seem to really get along with talking with both more conservative and or right and left voices, if that distinction's worth anything. Um, how do you
Yeah, I
have
think it is. It's worth something for sure.
how do you feel like how can you have good conversations with people from the opposite end of the political spectrum, considering it feels so divided in politics by political thought today?
I mean, I think someone has to be intellectually honest. And if they're not, then it's not really worth having a conversation with them. But if they are intellectually honest, then I think you could have a conversation across the political spectrum. Of course, there's a line. I would never talk to an out and out racist, for example, because there's just no talking there. But beyond that, I think it's actually useful to have those sorts of exchanges.
Okay. And then what do you think is, if it's possible, what are the solutions to save the history profession?
Um, mass organization amongst tenure track faculty
Uh, and that would do what necessarily? That would like
to
stop the
pressure administration to stop getting rid of tenure track lines and to stop using adjunct labor.
yeah.
Basically, I think that's what would need to happen. I'm not especially sanguine about the possibility of that.
Okay, yeah. Um, yeah, because I mean, just as a TA, I can tell you that a TA labor, I think TA used to be considered more of a helping out the student type of thing, and now it's pretty much they're using TAs to kind of prop up classes and just use it as cheap labor for
Yeah, of
teaching
course.
classes.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and stuff like that needs to end for the history crisis to end. No, I'm not sure. I don't think that's likely to happen.
Maybe there needs to be some sort of institution think tank behind it. Um, so where in this the philosophy of history, where do you come down? Are you more interested, or do you think that the movement of history is more individual agents, or do you come down more on the side of institutions or what matter?
I mean, I think ultimately that one of the most important tasks of the historian is to identify causal forces. And I think it's obviously different in different situations. In some instances, it's material forces that are more important, and in other instances, it's ideational or ideological forces are more important. In some instances, it's agents. In some instances, it's structure. And it's hard to, have a grand philosophy of history to describe all of history. But I guess if I were to do that, I mean, I think the classic Marxist approach is broadly correct that material forces are, the base of history, and things move out of those. But of course, when you're actually looking at history, there are circulations, the base and the superstructure interact, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about how you think we don't live in an ideological age anymore. Um, do you think that that's possible to change at all?
I don't know. I basically just mean that like if the 19th and 20th centuries, the second half of the 19th century and most of the 20th century were extreme ideological moments where people were really proffering ideologies, were willing to fight and die for them, and it just doesn't seem like that is the case any longer.
Okay, so if you have any, because we're running up against time, do you have any, and I'm also out of questions, honestly. If you have anything you'd like to kind of tell the listener of where to find you or any new books, uh, give you a couple minutes to or a couple seconds to do that.
Sure, if people want to, I'm on Twitter at @dbessner, and I have a podcast called American Prestige that is about international news and history and stuff like that.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Have a nice one.